Hello and welcome to Chapter 14. Chapter 14, we are going to talk about assessment and language testing. Now, what's the outline for this chapter? Number one, I'm going to tell you about assessment and testing. Later, we are talking about the principles of language assessment. After that, we are getting familiar with some test types, historical developments in language testing, and finally, some alternative activities or actions in order to have the assessment in our classes. Finally, we will get familiar with major international exams around the world. Now, let's begin with the language assessment and testing. Why do we have tests in our class or in our language schools? Number one, in order to show or try to have our students' progress. And the students need this from us, okay? To see their weak points or power points. When they have a test with us, they see that, okay, I need to work more on my writing, or there's a problem with my grammar, okay? And they can understand their own problems. The next thing is that we can use the tests in order to design our future lesson plans for our classes. Okay, now, let's go to some common principles of language testing. Number one, a test must be practical, or we call it practicality of the test. You can easily run it in your school. The test should not be expensive, okay? The test could be a multiple choice, 20 questions, you assign, collect them in half an hour, that's great. So the first principle for a successful test is the practicality. Number two, we talk about the reliability. It means that you can also repeat this test with the other groups of your students, and they all get the same results, okay? So it shows their success in different tries. Now, the next thing is the validity. So when I say validity, though it has its own types, like face or content, but I give you one real example. In my class, I teach conditional sentences or comparatives, okay? My test should check their own understanding of comparatives. So I cannot teach comparatives, okay, and give them a multiple choice test of tenses, okay? So the test has to design or has to measure what it's supposed to measure. That is the validity. Now, there are some types of it, like we have the content validity, that the content of the test measures what it intends for. The next thing is the face. It has to be like the test. It has to need the address, the bio of your students, okay? We need to give them the answer sheet. It has the instruction, okay? It has the marks on the right side. So these are all the face validity. The third type of validity is the construct one. Sometimes some theories in our classes, they underpin our approaches. Suppose I teach a passage in a class and I do believe that a communicative approach is my theory behind, or is my philosophy in the class. So my test should be run in a kind of communicative way. If so, I'm following a very good construct validity. When we talk about test, another principle is authenticity. Sometimes I collect the sentences, parts, or sectors of my test from authentic sources. And the next thing is the washback effect. The washback effect, it means the type of impact my test has on my students. My students, the night before, they study hard. Okay, and they get a kind of a stress, but this is a positive stress. It forces them to study harder. After the test, also, when they get the result, they become happy, and it motivates them to go on and study further. Another thing, let's go now to test types. I'm just going to name them for you. Sometimes we have language proficiency tests, like the IELTS or TOEFL tests, HGRE test. Sometimes we have a school placement or language placement test. I want to come to your school and then you have no idea about me. We have a short quiz, and I tell you, hey, you are upper intermediate. That student is intermediate. Go to this class, go to that class. These are the placement tests we run in our schools. The next thing is that we have sometimes assessments for needs analysis. Sometimes we want to check our syllabus. So we call it the syllabus test. Sometimes we have review tests or quizzes. Every week you have a quiz to see your students' progress. Now, the other types of tests I can name is progress test, achievement test, diagnostic test, placement, and aptitude. So one more time, placement is the time when you go to a college and then they want to tell you or diagnose your level. They give you a test. Then they put you in like intermediate or elementary or advanced level, okay, based on the placement test. The next type is the aptitude test, that it checks your abilities, especially future abilities. In some companies, they have aptitude tests to see how their new employees or workers decide for the future of the company. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the historical development in language testing. We have basically two approaches. One of them is the discrete point assessment or testing and integrative assessment. Some educators believe that when you're going to check a student's grammar, we have to only give them the grammar test. But that one is a little bit out-fashioned. These days, we try to integrate or combine different tests. Suppose I'm going to give you a test. It's a reading passage. This test at the same time checks your vocabulary or your level of vocabulary. It also checks your reading comprehension. Sometimes some grammar questions are extracted from the passage. So I can check your grammar, and finally I want you to write a summary for me. So at the same time, I assess 2-3 components and language skills. This is an example of an integrative approach. And we believe that this gives us a comprehensive outlook from your level, especially your language level. Now, let me go to the next part about what are the alternatives for language tests. Should I only give quiz, exam, test to my students, or there are the other ways I can use in my class and assess my students' progress? Okay, before this, let's go and think about two terms. So we have summative and formative assessment. Summative is the time, and especially when you teach students for a period of time, at the end we need a test. And that test is the summative. It comes from summary, what they already accomplished in your class. Sometimes we have formative assessment. Formative assessment includes ongoing feedback, and then you have weekly or monthly assessment. So both would be okay for us as teachers. We have to keep in our mind some tests during the course and one comprehensive or final test at the end. Now, the alternatives is that sometimes I ask my students to write a journal about their language learning, about their progress. Sometimes I want them to collect the activities or the projects they did in my class. This is an alternative for us to assess. Now, there are the other ways. Sometimes we have self or peer assessment. Sometimes the students have a very wise assessment from their own work in our class. Now, that is an alternative. The last part of this chapter, we have some major international exams. You are familiar already with the IELTS, TOEFL, or GRE tests. Here we tell you more. We also talk about Canadian standard tests. You can find them here. So please read the table. At the end, we talk about some big organizations which design language tests for students, like ETS, Educational Testing Service. We talk about UCE SOLE, that is also very popular by the University of Cambridge. And the last thing, we talk about the Pearson test of academic English. English. So try to read these definitions, and I hope you like it. After this part, I'm going to talk more about your task 10, that is summary writing. So in task 10, I want you to write a summary over the main concepts in chapter 14. Let's go, and I'll explain more. Hello again. I'm going to tell you about task 10, okay? So far, you read the chapter for assessment and testing. Now, what we expect you to do for this part. Now, in this part, I want you to go to your chapter, again read it, underline the keywords, highlight the important terms, and then we want you to write a summary for us. Now, over which concepts? I wrote 6 concepts for you here, like language assessment and testing, principles of language assessment, different test types, historical developments in language assessment, alternative ways to assess our students, and finally, major international exams. So, I want you to write a summary, or your instructor wants you to write a summary about the essay layout. We expect you to write about 300 to 400 words. Please use the font that is Arial, and the size 12 would be okay for us. It's based on you. It could be 6, 7, 8, 10 paragraphs. Okay? So the size 300 to 400. And when you're done, please submit it to your instructor and wait for our feedback. Okay? Thank you and good luck with task 10.